So good to see you. Welcome, everybody. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. We did it, folks. We are at 5 for 5. On Monday, I said my goal was to do 5 streams in a row, and here we are. Here we are, 5 streams in a row. 5 for 5. Wow, folks. That's good. Nothing more satisfying than setting a goal for yourself, turn out the light, and achieving it, and successfully achieving it. And we, as a community, we have achieved it. And we will have many more lives this month, many more lives next month, many more lives in the future. Our community is growing and growing very rapidly. We have been through some exciting twists and turns over the last couple years. Books have been published, debates have happened, smear campaigns have been launched, world events have taken place. I remember the first time that there were 200 people watching this stream live was the day after Trump murdered Qasem Soleimani. After Donald Trump killed the Iranian general, then I remember suddenly I watched, and the numbers on here, we were up to 200. And now there's barely a live that goes by that we don't hit 200. So there you go. Writing the super chat down, by the way. But yeah, I mean, we're doing some amazing stuff. We're doing some amazing stuff, and we're going to keep going. We are 5 for 5. Hopefully I'll be back, later this weekend. Tomorrow is going to be a very, very busy day for me. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. Some of what tomorrow will bring, not everything, but some of what's going on tomorrow we'll talk about. But I'm very excited. I am very, 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 very excited about this community and what we're doing. I look at what the John Brown volunteers are doing. Shout out to them. They've got their own space on the Center for Political Innovation website. Great folks. I look at what Students and Youth for a New America is doing. I look at what our community does. I look at what the folks on Infrared are doing. I look at what the folks on, Jackson Hinkle and his associates have been doing. This is an amazing thing. We are giving people real solid leftism. And it's really, really amazing. I tweeted out earlier today, real leftists, we're mad about war. We're mad about Big Pharma. Thank you, Old Gringo, for your thank you very much for your super chat and for your kind words. We real leftists, we're mad about war. We're mad about poverty. We're mad about Big Pharma. We're mad about exploitation of the working class. But the synthetic left, they're not mad about all of that. They're mad that working class people are mad about that in a politically incorrect way, right? And that's really, if you look at what a lot of these synth left people do, they're not really mad at the crimes of capitalism. They're mad that there are working people waking up and demanding things change, and they're doing it they're not following the rules in how they get mad about it. So it's really kind of sad. We're not here to try and protect the Eastern establishment, the Rockefellers, the DuPonts, the Carnegies, the Mellons, the Morgans, Silicon Valley, Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos. We're not here to protect them from the upsurge of right-wing populism. We are here to demand socialism. We are here to oppose capitalism. We are here to stand with people around the world that are fighting for justice. We're here to stand with the anti-imperialist bloc of countries. We're here to stand with working families who want things better. We're not the synthetic left. We are not defenders of the establishment. We are not attackers of anti-establishment folks. We are opponents of the emerging global order, and we are fighting for a new global system, a new system of globalization in which countries' national sovereignty is respected, in which the banks, factories, and industries are organized to serve public good and not profits, in which poverty is being eradicated, in which human creativity and growth is no longer restrained. We are fighting for the genius of human beings, fighting for the creativity of human beings, fighting for the aspiration of human beings to build a better world and leave the world a better place than it was when they came into it, provide a better life for their children. That's what we're here for, and we're doing a great job. So hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. The way we do things here, left, avoid othering. The way we do things here is I give my opening remarks. After I give my opening remarks, from there, I do the roll call where I call you out as I see you, names and locations. And then, after having written down all the super chats, I then answer your super chats until the show is over. That's how the show works. That is how the cookie crumbles. I'm going to probably not go too long tonight because I've got a big day tomorrow and I'm quite a bit tired, but we did 5 for 5. We committed to doing 5 for 5 and we did 5 for 5. And that is an exhilarating feeling to be able to commit to something and do it. And we should all, you should think of things in your life like that, things that you struggle to do, and hold yourself accountable that way. Make little goals like this. We did 5 for 5. It's great. All right. So Brezhnev, Husak, Honecker, and Zhukov. Okay, I know who Brezhnev is, and I know who Honecker is. The other names I'm not familiar with. Brezhnev, Honecker. All right. So I just wanted to give my opening remarks. So I'll give my opening remarks. I'll try to be brief. I'm not going to give too long of opening remarks, but I do want to talk about some things and give my opening remarks, and then from there, do the roll call and then answer your super chat questions. So it's funny because a number of people were asking me if I was planning to talk about the patriotism, socialist patriotism debate. And I mean, I'm not going to get on here and just straight up address that question because I've done that before many, many times, right? And that's raging. There's all these people that are furious with Jackson Hinkle. How dare he say that he's an American patriot? And I've addressed that. I've talked about how we represent the progressive side of American history. I've talked about at the same time that all the awful things were happening in U.S. history. There was people fighting back and resisting. I've talked about all of this. And I've addressed that question. So if you want to go see me address that question, go back to Monday where I talked about that for 40, 50 minutes straight. But there's an aspect of this debate that I think gets to something deeper. It gets to something much deeper. And that's what I wanted to talk to you all about. I wanted to talk to you all about today. Folks, during the Vietnam War, there were many soldiers who turned against the war. Did you know that? There were many, many soldiers who turned against the Vietnam War. And they defected. In some cases, they shot or fragged their officers. A lot of them just went AWOL, right? They were absent without leave. They just quit the army. They just left. People talked about how in the height of the Vietnam War, 1970, 1971, in U.S. military bases, they would show a movie at the military base. They would show a movie, and before they showed the movie at the military base, they would play the national anthem. And how in the movie theater, on the military base, nobody would stand up. Nobody would stand up for the national anthem because that's how unimpressed with the war they were, right? Gosh. That's how alienated they were from the establishment. And U.S. soldiers on military bases, right, would not stand up for the national anthem. I've heard many stories like this from the Vietnam War era. And I knew a lot of old communists who'd been active, and a number of them were Vietnam veterans. Not very many of them, but some of them were Vietnam veterans that I knew. And they would talk about what these years were like. They would talk about how, if a soldier would quit and would defect, he could walk around everywhere and no one would say anything to him. He could walk around, say, I'm deserting from the army. I walked away from the army, and people would go, okay, well, that's what I would do if I was you. Um, obviously there were people who burned their draft cards. Obviously there were people who refused to fight. Obviously there were people who went to Canada to avoid fighting. But there were also a number of soldiers who in Vietnam refused to fight. One story that I heard is that apparently there was an African-American soldier from the United States in Vietnam. He was out on patrol. There's a white guy standing next to him, another white guy standing next to him. They're walking through the jungle. Kaboom. White guy next to him, blown away. Kaboom. White guy next to him, blown away. And then he's standing there in the jungle, and he hears a voice say in very broken English, "Black soldier, put down your gun. You are oppressed by the racist American ruling class, and we have no conflict with you." Thank you, Neil. Thank you very much, Neil Fraser. And I heard that story, and I can't verify it, but I heard it many times. Many times I heard that story. Coup in Guinea. Many times I heard that story. And there's been this narrative sent out, about what happened in the 1960s. I grew up hearing it, right? That, the protesters were disrespecting our troops, and they spit on the soldiers, and that's why no one should ever protest a war ever again, because during the 60s there were these hippies that hated America, and they were spitting on the soldiers and all of that. Well, if you look at what really happened, it was the opposite. The anti-war movement didn't spit on the soldiers. The anti-war movement recruited the soldiers. Jane Fonda had a whole tour that she did called FTA, for F the Army, where she did a whole show aimed at convincing U.S. Army soldiers to quit, to not fight in the war. She did this, the FTA show. You can Google it. There was the American Servicemen's Union, which was created by the Workers' World Party. It was headed by Andy Stapp, who I met. And Andy Stapp, a great man who was in the Army, was a communist. He formed the American Servicemen's Union, a union of soldiers in the Army. They had their list of demands, they had their own newspaper, and they were a union for soldiers. And they helped facilitate soldiers defecting from the military. There was the VVAW, the Vietnam Veterans Against the War, which was formed by John Kerry, but later it became connected to the Maoists, to the Revolutionary Communist Party, the Bolshevikian people. And the anti-war movement worked really hard to recruit soldiers. Why? Why did it do that? They were against the war. Why would they want to recruit soldiers? Because the soldiers are who made the war happen. If you don't have any soldiers, you don't have a war. So getting the very people that were fighting the wars to change their minds and to realize that the war was wrong was a very necessary thing to do. Made sense. And I've heard from many anti-war activists from the era that soldiers would often seek out anti-war people just to debate them, just to argue with them. Because when you're a soldier in a war, you can't ignore it, right? You and I, we're living our ordinary lives. Maybe if we're real political, we study world events. But if you're a soldier and you're sent to Vietnam, or you're sent to Afghanistan, or you're sent to Iraq, that war is your life, and you might die. And so making sure that it's, trying to find out what it's really about is very, very important. And I used to hear the story of, these GIs, when they were on leave or whatever, they would go and try to find an anti-war protester. Who do you know who's a protester? And they would go track them down, not to agree with them, but to debate them, to make sure that the guy was wrong because their life was on the line. And that the anti-war movement got very good at arguing with soldiers. They had whole manuals and classes how to debate a soldier, how to convince a soldier that the Vietnam War is wrong, that we shouldn't be in Vietnam. You could say the anti-war movement in the United States was obsessed with convincing soldiers that the war was wrong, recruiting soldiers to the anti-war movement. You don't believe me? There's an awful movie called Forrest Gump. It stars, what's his name? Tom Hanks. It's an awful movie. It's actually really anti-left-wing and stuff. But one accurate thing in the movie is it shows this. It shows that at anti-war protests, they often had soldiers be the main speakers and describe what was really going on in Vietnam. They had, former soldiers, get up. There were soldiers who gathered and they threw their medals over the White House fence. They threw back their medals. I heard stories of some of these old Vietnam veterans would get up at anti-war rallies. They would get on the bullhorn and they would shout, "I'm a murderer. I killed innocent people. The Vietnamese just wanted to reunite their country, and I went over there. I was the colonizer. I was the occupier. I was the redcoat, and they were the George Washingtons." This is the story of the anti-war movement. But now, one of the many deviations that I frequently see among the synthetic left, one of the frequent deviations I see is I see people try to cancel soldiers who are now anti-war. Because, there's this guy, there's an individual who has a podcast, who's a former soldier from Iraq, who became a member of Iraq Veterans Against the War, has spoken against the wars. And rather than saying, great, here's a guy who actually fought over there, who's turned against the wars, I see hate on the internet. How dare they have a war criminal in their organization? How dare they? This guy served in the military. He has no right to be in any left-wing group. And I look at this and I'm perplexed. What is this? What in the world are these people talking about? I might not agree with this individual about this issue or that issue, but the fact that he used to be a volunteer who signed up to fight in the U.S. military, and he's changed his mind so much that he's now a communist, anti-imperialist, outspoken in opposition to the war, is a good thing. We need many, many more people like this guy. So what in the world is going on that there is a desire to, instead of embracing this fellow, shaming him, who does he think he is? You know what? I find it perplexing. Very, very perplexing. Very, very, very perplexing. Very, very, very perplexing. And then I think about the movement to abolish slavery in the United States, the abolitionist movement. And I've talked about this on many different live streams. The abolitionist movement, right? There were some religious groups in the United States that were always opposed to slavery. Quakers were always opposed to slavery. Mennonites always were opposed to slavery. But there were a lot of religious groups that they weren't really sure. But it was about 30 years before the U.S. Civil War, among white Americans in New England and eventually spreading to Ohio and Illinois, there was a mass religious movement called the Second Great Awakening. And it was American religious people who were against slavery. And they had tent revival meetings, and they were very religious, and they engaged in all kinds of practices, speaking in tongues, and a lot of the stuff we now associate with Pentecostalism. But one of their main messages was that slavery was wrong. And it was this mass religious group, mass religious movement, really. I mean, many different religious groups come out of that. Mormonism is descended from the Second Great Awakening. The Seventh-day Adventist movement is descended from this time. Many, many different religious groups that are still a big part of the United States emerged in the 1830s, the 1820s, during this mass movement of religious fervor in the United States that was opposed to slavery, the Second Great Awakening. And probably one of the most famous American hymns, is from the Second Great Awakening. It's called Amazing Grace, and it was written by a slave trader. It was written by a guy who was a slave trader, and he was somebody who went to Africa and took people that were slaves and took them from Africa to the United States, and many of them died along the way. He was a murderer. He was a slave trader. He was a murderer. He was involved in a barbaric, horrendous practice. But supposedly, the story goes, we don't know what really happened, but according to the story, there was a thunderstorm on the sea, and he feared for his life, and he knew deep down what he was doing was wrong. And when the storm cleared, he told the ship, the sailors and all that, he said, "We're turning this boat around." Turned the boat around. Didn't go to Africa, didn't trade any more slaves. And that man's song, that he wrote was the anthem of the Second Great Awakening. And a big theme in the Second Great Awakening was forgiveness, was the idea that one can repent, the idea that one can recognize that what one did and is doing is wrong. And one can turn around and start doing something different. And that was a very big part of this. I hear stories of Gus Hall and Eugene Debs and William Z. Foster. Mark's bio. And the stories that I hear about them are interesting. There's a book called Black Bolshevik. It's written by Harry Haywood, who was a leader of the Communist Party, who was an African American. He talks about how when there was a strike in the coal mines in Pennsylvania, it was white coal miners, many of whom were racist, went on strike. And so African Americans would be hired as replacement labor. And he talked about in the late 20s, when this coal strike happened, he went to Pennsylvania to urge African Americans not to become scab laborers in the coal mine and not to do that. He talks about that, how he went, and his job was to try and convince African Americans not to scab on the strike. And why would African Americans scab on the strike when the union is racist? When labor unions are whites only? When labor unions, in effect, keep black people from getting jobs, it makes sense why black people would hate the labor movement. A lot of black people really hated the labor movement because the labor movement was racist. The labor movement, the American Federation of Labor, it barred black people from getting jobs in coal mines, getting jobs in meatpacking facilities. If it was a union plant, no black person could work there. And they talked about how unions used to have what they called hate strikes, where one black person would come into the factory. All the workers would stop working until the boss got that black person out of there. That's called a hate strike. And that unions were notorious for having hate strikes, they were called. And it wasn't just against black people. Sometimes it would be against foreign-born workers. Sometimes it would be against non-English speaking workers. Sometimes it would be against Roman Catholic workers. Sometimes it would be against women. Sailors, used to refuse any woman to be allowed on their ship, right? If a woman came onto their ship for any reason, they would stop working. They said, oh, women are bad luck. It's bad luck to have a woman on a ship. If a woman came onto the ship, all the sailors would go on strike until that woman got off the ship. These things happened. It was awful. It was awful. But when did the labor movement win great victories? When did it win its greatest victories? Really, the moment where the American labor movement was really on fire and kicking ass was 1934. It was the summer of 1934. And in 1934, there was the Great Depression happening. And the Teamsters went on strike in Minneapolis, led by the Trotskyites. In Toledo, Ohio, the auto light workers who worked at an electrical power plant, they went on strike. And then in San Francisco, the dock workers of San Francisco went on strike. And the docks are very important because that's how so many products get into the country. And the dock workers of San Francisco had gone on strike many times, but their strikes were never successful. Why? Because generally, when the dock workers of San Francisco would go on strike, black people would be hired as replacement laborers. But that didn't happen this time. And why did it not happen? It didn't happen because the Communist Party was leading this strike. It wasn't led by the phony AFL. It wasn't led by Social Democrats. It was led by the Communist Party. And the Communist Party went to the black community and they said, one of the demands of our strike will be that black people are hired to work on the docks. We're going to demand that we get a hiring hall. We get to decide who gets to work on the docks and who doesn't. People will get hired through the union. They'll get hired through the union, and we will make sure there are black dock workers in San Francisco. And furthermore, the Communist Party had a lot of respect in the black community for opposing Jim Crow segregation, for promoting the rights of African Americans, for their black belt thesis, calling for an independent black republic in the territories of the United States that the black people were concentrated in the South. And because of that, the Communist Party was able to unify the black community and the Teamsters Union and other unions in the city to back and support the dock workers. And the dock workers of San Francisco went on strike. And it was a general strike. The city of San Francisco shut down. Dock workers won union representation. It was a national emergency. No ships were being unloaded. It forced the bosses to the table. The 1934 San Francisco general strike is a big deal in U.S. history. It's a very big deal in U.S. history. And the way the Communist Party won that huge victory was by convincing a union of white workers who were racist to abandon their racism. That's how they did it. The 1934 general strike wave. And those three strikes that I just mentioned, right? San Francisco, Minneapolis, Toledo, they weren't the only ones. All throughout the South in 1934, there were sharecroppers unions among poor, low-income farmers across the South who went on strike. In South Carolina, they declared a state of emergency, and the military was called out to stop the sharecroppers' strikes. And those unions that the Communist Party built, that were sharecropper unions, they were interracial. They were black and white together. And that was illegal at the time. In southern states, it was illegal. It was illegal for black and white people to be in the same organization, in the same labor union. But didn't matter. They did it anyway. And the stories you hear The stories you hear of white workers going to a Communist Party meeting and seeing that there are black people there and being very uncomfortable. But then Gus Hall starts giving a talk. William Z. Foster starts speaking, explaining that racism is the reason that poverty is so widespread in the South. Racism is the reason that there's not a strong labor movement in the South. That playing black and white against each other is dividing the working class. That racism is a tool of the bosses to divide the working class, to hurt all working people by giving white workers a little bit of privilege. You hear the story of white workers who previously had been members of the Ku Klux Klan, hearing this, taking their Ku Klux Klan membership cards out and ripping them up, and signing up to join the Communist Party. This is the history of our movement. This is our history. I'm talking about the Vietnam War, talking about the struggle to abolish slavery. I'm talking about the labor movement of the 1930s. This is us. That's who we are. If you're a communist in the United States, that's you. May not have been your ancestors. Your ancestors might have been doing something else. Doesn't matter. If you've declared yourself in the United States to be a communist, that is the movement that you are joining. This is your heritage. Communists in the United States are part of a long tradition of progressive organizers who have fought for justice, against war, against racism, against the exploitation of the working class, to build unions, to win women the right to vote. And this is us. And when socialism comes to the United States, it will be this current